Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 43 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and relevant information that pilots like you can use. Coming up in the news, according to the NTSB, general aviation has just had its best safety record in 50 years. And receiving IFR clearances here in the U.S. may get a little easier for pilots in the future, and we'll tell you how that could work. And the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, has launched a program to recruit flight students exclusively from just one university here in the U.S. And finally, military veterans are just a little bit upset about a proposed bill that would limit some of their benefits. And we'll tell you how that relates to general aviation in a moment. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or student pilot, and hopefully let's have some fun along the way. I'm going to share part of my 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot, author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And I'm also a specialist in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Last week, in episode 42, I talked about the preliminary NTSB report on the Icon A5 crash that killed baseball star Roy Halladay, and about the results of a survey in which our podcast listeners gave feedback on the various portable ADSB receivers they're using. So if you're thinking of buying an ADSB receiver, you might want to check out that episode. And this week, we've started a new survey about aviation headsets. So if you use one, tell us about your experience with your headset, any issues you've encountered. And if you're thinking of buying one, tell us which one you're thinking about. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, and we'll bring the results to you here in a future episode. But now stand by, because the news starts now. From avweb.com comes this story that the NTSB says that in 2016, the fatal accident rate dropped to its lowest level in 50 years. It's now less than one fatal accident per 100,000 hours flown. Overall, aviation deaths decreased slightly from 416 in 2015 to 412 in 2016. Now, they say about 94% of those fatalities occurred in general aviation accidents. The other accidents occurred in commuter and on-demand aircraft, including charter, air taxi, and medical service. The GA decrease, by the way, occurred while all other forms of transportation, such as cars, trains, and boats, all showed increases in their fatality rate. Overall, general aviation accidents totaled 1,266. That would be all accidents, most of which were non-fatal, of which 213 resulted in fatalities. Now, that's based on 21.3 million flight hours. We've talked about this before. That number comes from a survey of a number of pilots, and I've gotten one of those surveys in the past. So if you get one from the FAA, please fill it out, because that helps them estimate how many flight hours are flown. Now, they don't really tell us why the accident rate went down, and it's kind of hard to speculate on that. But it is just good news that the fatal accident rate seems to be decreasing. From AOPA comes a story that I'm really excited about. A new app could deliver IFR clearances to mobile devices like an iPhone or an Android. Now, the prototype app shows the potential, they say, to reduce pilot and controller workloads, save time, and lower the possibility of clearance readback errors, according to the developer. The app is being developed by the MITRE Corporation. That's a not-for-profit organization that conducts federally funded research in defense, intelligence, aviation, homeland security, and other areas. According to a video illustration briefing on the prototype app, obtaining an IFR clearance from a non-towered airport today by phone or radio can take several minutes, and the spoken clearances may contain names of fixes that the pilot might misspell when copying the clearance. Text-based clearances provided by the app avoid such misunderstandings and save time consumed when a pilot must clarify spellings. After receiving a clearance from the app, the pilot can then request a release through the app as long as he provides the runway to be used and an estimated time of departure. ATC then uses the app to issue a release time, a release void time, and any additional instructions. After those steps are done, the controller clicks the Approve Release button, Now, the Minor Corporation briefing listed several accidents and unsafe events that occurred in connection with clearance difficulties and notes that the app offers safety improvements over such practices as pilots departing visually into marginal weather condition and attempting to receive an IFR clearance when airborne. And of course, it's often impossible to reach ATC via the radio from the ground at some airports, making it necessary to call on the telephone. This sounds like a much better way to go. And I hope they will allow this app to be used at towered airports, because we often have a lot of congestion on the ground frequency when IFR clearances are being issued. From avweb.com, 8 GA advocacy groups signed a letter this week protesting a bill that's in the House that would put a cap on the amount of money that veterans could get for flight training programs. Other education tracks, they say, are not subject to caps, and they say that capping funds for flight training degree program virtually guarantees that vets seeking to use their GI Bill benefits to enter the aviation industry will have insufficient money to achieve their goals. Well, the letter says they will either abandon their pursuit or they'll be burdened with significant personal debt through either personal funding or taking on student loans. They say this will harm veterans and limit the employment opportunities in the aviation industry. While the current bill, they say, contains numerous provisions to improve the program's efficacy, the proposed capping of program payments undermines the important goal of helping our nation's vets enter a field where they are desperately needed. And the groups that signed on are EAA, AOPA, GAMA, NATA, NBAA, Helicopter Association International, and a few others. And in experimental aircraft news, this comes from flyer.uk, though we've seen this in other sources as well. Van's Aircraft, congratulations. They now have 10,000 flying aircraft. Their 10,000th kit plane has flown its maiden flight. Now, Van started selling planes back in 1973, so it took them 44 years, or about 1.6 aircraft taking to the air each day. Now, the 10,000th kit plane was built by David Porter of Martinsburg, West Virginia. He spent 3.5 years building his Van's RV7. He put a Lycoming 0360 engine in it, a Hartzell blended airfoil prop, and Garmin VFR avionics. And this first flight was on November 24th. They say there are probably more than 10,000 Van's aircraft flying, but they don't know about all of them because many builders go ahead and fly their aircraft without letting the factory know. Now, this increase from 9,000 to 10,000 RVs took just 33 months or under 1,000 days. So currently about one new RV leaves the ground every day, or about 360 last year. Now, by comparison, they say that Cirrus, the leader in certified single-engine production-built aircraft, will deliver around 300 airplanes in 2017. Well, that's a little on the low side. I've been to the factory, and it's going to be significantly more than that. But the point is well made. There are about as many Van's aircraft taking to the air every year as there are Cirrus aircraft, so that's really pretty amazing. Now, the founder, Dick Van Grunsven, who, by the way, we interviewed on the Airplane Geeks podcast about 2 years ago, he said that Vans continues to democratize GA to offer as many people as possible the opportunity to experience affordable total performance aircraft. He says RVs have been flown around the world over both poles in more than 50 countries. And he says, over the years, RVs have morphed from being an interesting fringe area curiosity to GA mainstays. Absolutely, these aircraft are now mainstream. Congratulations to Vans and to everybody who's building or has built a Vans RV aircraft. And for this next story, if you are a university student or plan to be one and you'd like to get a job with the federal government, you might be interested in this. This comes from generalaviationnews.com, and they say that U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the CPB, their Air and Marine Operation Unit, the AMO, has launched a program to recruit students exclusively from the University of North Dakota, that's UND, for careers as airborne law enforcement officers. Under the program, sophomores and juniors will learn the foundation of federal law enforcement while continuing their studies at UND. Now, AMO's mission is to detect, sort, track, intercept, and apprehend criminals using sophisticated aviation techniques. And by the way, you may recall probably 3-4 years ago, they were in the news because they were stopping a lot of GA aircraft that were flying perfectly legal within the United States from one state to another. In fact, one of those stops was of a police chief. When asked why he was flying a wavering path to an out-of-the-way airport, he pointed out they had cheap gas there. Anyway, AMO apparently no longer is doing those kinds of things, but this program is going to provide up to 15 students the opportunity to work as aviation enforcement trainees. The students will be hired as federal employees with flexible full and part-time schedules, and their responsibility is going to be assist with the development of operational plans for various missions and interfacing with state and local law enforcement services. Upon graduation and completion of a polygraph, the trainees will become aviation enforcement agents, and after they have 1,000 hours, they will be eligible to apply to become an air interdiction agent. They can operate out of over 74 locations across the country, and AMO currently has 1,800 employees, including 700 pilots and 200 aircraft. They say this is an unprecedented opportunity for aviation students and that they can earn over $100,000 after 2 years of full-time service. To be eligible, an applicant must be a current UND student, have a GPA of 3.0 or higher, and pass a background investigation. The first group of student trainees are expected to be announced in December 2017. And finally, in international news, this comes from flyer.co.uk. Pipistrel signs a big deal to build aircraft in China. The Slovenian firm Pipistrel has signed a big deal with a Chinese entrepreneur to build a factory in China to manufacture two of its latest aircraft, the electric-powered Alpha Electro two-seat trainer and the top-of-the-line Panthera four-seater. Now, if you're not familiar with these aircraft, we've talked about them before. These are all-electric aircraft, so they've got big batteries and electric motor in them. What's exciting about them is that the cost of operation is incredibly low. The big challenge, of course, has been getting sufficient range in these aircraft to make them useful trainers. But some of these electric aircraft now have up to 2 hours of range, which I think is perfectly fine for doing pattern work to teach landings. Now, Pipistrel Asia Pacific will own the technology and the production rights for the two aircraft for 11 countries in Southeast Asia. This project is going to include a new airport, an airport factory, a villas compound, and an aviation university built on a 130 hectare site. Now, I've converted that for you. That's 320 acres. The complex is next to a highway, which connects it about 30 minutes away to Nanjing, and they say direct airline connection will be established from Nanjing to Slovenia in 2019. All very exciting. I can't wait to get my first flight in one of these Pipistrel electric aircraft. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, the NTSB says that distractions are the biggest cause of loss of control accidents, and we'll tell you what you need to do when you get distracted. Plus, listener questions. A student pilot in Mississippi asks, what should his priorities be when he's learning to fly? And we'll explain to another listener why, even though he has ADSB out in his aircraft, why it is that he's not seeing all the traffic that he should on his portable ADSB receiver. Stick around. We'll be right back with answers to those questions and more right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Before we talk about how you can deal with distractions when they occur in the cockpit, let me give you a few quick updates. First, I am sorry that I missed you last week. I was sick. I was not able to fly for about 5 days, though I'm looking forward to starting flying again tomorrow. So I did miss 1 week of podcasting for the first week since I started the show about 8 months ago. And that's bound to happen. We're a solo act here. It's all me. Nobody else in the wings here helping to do all the work that brings you the show here each week. So please understand, I'd love to be here, but I had to take care of myself first. But let's talk about some other things that are more interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I was quite honored to be presented with an award by the NAA, the National Aeronautic Association. Now, that's the oldest aviation organization here in the United States. They are the nation's official record keepers for United States aviation records. So anytime you hear about a record, it's the NAA that certifies it. Now, they are also the caretakers for some of the most prestigious aviation awards as well. So, for example, they administer the Collier Trophy, which is kind of the Nobel Prize of Aviation here in the United States. I was honored to be on the selection committee a year ago, selecting the winner of that award. But they turned around and they gave me an award, so I'm pretty delighted to it. They presented me with a certificate that says, To Max Trescott for dedicating 16 years of aviation safety and education as a flight instructor, lecturer, author, podcaster, and the past president of the Aero Club of Northern California. Signed by Greg Principato, who's the president and CEO of the NAA. In fact, he came out to the dinner and spoke very nicely for a number of minutes about me and what I've done in the past. And so it was quite flattering to receive that award. So I just want to thank the NAA for honoring me in that way. And here's another piece of good news, honored in yet another way. I don't know if you're familiar with Spotify, but they have 100 million listeners with a large percentage of millennials, folks who are under age 35. So if you happen to be out there listening to us on Spotify, welcome. And if you're not, you can download the Spotify app for either the iPhone or Android and then listen to your choice of music and the Aviation News Talk podcast. And guess what? Currently, we are the only aviation podcast available on Spotify. I applied to get on that system about 4 months ago. And just got approved. So thanks so much for listening, and check out Spotify if you want. Oh, and an easy way to do that is I've put a link into the show notes, so you can just tap the artwork on your podcast player, and you should find it there. Or go to aviationnewstalk.com and look along the right-hand column, and you'll find a Listen on Spotify button up there near the top. And by the way, it's a free app. I don't pay for the premium version, but I did just get an email from them a day or two ago that said they are offering 3 months of the premium version for just 99 cents, and the premium version allows you to listen ad-free, unlimited number of skips when you're listening to the music. You can also download and listen to songs offline and play any random music track that you want. So after 3 months, they say it goes to $9.99 per month. So check out Spotify and check out the Aviation News Talk podcast there. And longtime listeners know that I periodically will ferry aircraft across the country, especially for Cirrus owners. And somebody has just purchased an airplane here in California and wants it moved to Miami. So I'll be leaving in a day or two with that new owner. We'll fly it first down to Santa Monica, which is where I'll pick him up. That's where he's flying into. And then we'll take his airplane after he meets it there for the first time out to Miami. So our plan is to go on Thursday from Santa Monica to Tucson and then to Fort Stockton, Texas, and then to Houston, Texas, where we'll probably spend the night at the KHDW airport. That's up on the north side of town there. And the next day, Friday, we're looking to fly out to Mobile, Alabama, where I have been before. I visited the Continental factory a long time ago. And from there to Bartow, Florida, in Central Florida, and then down to Miami, Florida. And that's going to be a fun trip. Looking forward to that. And then 2 weeks later, it looks like I will be picking up a Cessna 182 in Vermont. Yes, what a great time. It's always chilly up there this time of year. But hopefully global warming will come to Vermont the day I go to pick up that 182 and bring it back to the California to its new owner. And let's see what else. Hey, I just want to give you an update on my new app. We have told you all about that. I haven't told you how popular it's become. I just looked, and last month, about 3% of all of our listens were on the new Aviation News Talk app, which you can download from the App Store. Guess what? In December so far, about 10% of our listens are on the app. So I guess people are discovering it and finding that it's a convenient way to listen to the show. So if you have a non-tech oriented friend that you'd like to turn on to podcasting and they have an Apple iPhone or iPad, tell them to go out to the App Store, not the podcast app, but the App Store. Search on Aviation News Talk and you can download that dedicated app for this podcast. And if you're not happy with the podcast player that you're using, heck, check it out yourself. And of course, that app was funded by our many Patreon supporters who I want to thank. The past 2 weeks here, we had 3 new supporters. That would be Moj Kazi. Moj is a client of mine. In fact, he's flying with me on that first leg from here down to Santa Monica later this week on the SR20. Larry Noe, back from New York, and Trevor Moody, all new Patreon supporters. Now, at the start of the show, I mentioned that we don't have advertisers on the show, but we do have expenses, so I always appreciate any of the monthly contributions we get from, right now, it's up to 72 Patreons who donate each month via credit card. And during the last show of the month, each month, I read the names of our biggest supporters, those who contribute at least $20 a month. And since I didn't get to do the last show of the month last week, I'll read their names now. Those contributors, our big supporters, are Jeremy Zawadny. He's a software developer. Peter Long, a pilot in Australia, formerly a colleague of mine, CFI here in Silicon Valley. Seth Lake, you heard his voice a few episodes ago, a military instructor, pilot, flight instructor in Arkansas. His website there is gonogo.aero for his podcast and flight school. My good friend Jason Blair, he's a pilot examiner. He runs the blog at jasonblair.net. Of course, we had him on the show recently as well. Joseph Haggerty II, he's a Mooney pilot down in Southern California. Thank you, sir. And Michael Rogers, a Cirrus owner, also in Southern California. Michael Spain, he's a student pilot in Oklahoma who's planning to buy a Cirrus. And we have one new addition to the list, and that's Larry Noe, who lives in New York, where I also used to live a long time ago, and he flies a Bonanza G36. So I want to thank all of you for your contributions, big and small, to the show. And if you're thinking, hey, I've been thinking about donating on Patreon, maybe December is the good month for you to take a moment and go do that. Go ahead and join our special group of listeners who support the show by just opening a web browser and typing aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And then you can make a contribution to the show of as little as $2 a month, and that cost will be billed to your credit card every month. And while you're on the Patreon site, check out the aviation stories that I post there on the blog. I just posted a news story a few minutes ago. It's a video, and it shows you what happens when a tug meets an A330 engine, and that happened here somewhere in the United States. There's a little bit of foul language, and then you get to watch them try and separate those two vehicles, the large airplane from the tug. Anyway, while you're there, check out our goals and consider supporting the show with a donation, and at the different contribution levels, you get different goodies. For example, everyone paying $4 a month and above, they get access to the original scripts for all of these shows, and at $8 a month and above, donors can see the news stories that I cut because I didn't have room for them in the show, and each week there are a number of those. Just remember, aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and thanks for your support. Hey, stick around because in 7 seconds we'll be back with tips on what to do when you find yourself distracted in the cockpit. Well, let's talk about distractions and how to deal with them. I think distractions are kind of like the weather. Everybody talks about them, but nobody does anything about it. And I wanted to get your feedback on this because I've been gathering this data for at least a couple of years. It's been a topic I've been very interested in it, but it's the first time I presented it to anybody in any way, shape, or form, and I would like to turn it into an article, so I'd like to get your feedback. Please send me all ideas you have in terms of, ideas that I might want to incorporate, things that you've experienced, for example, in your flying that had to do with distractions, anything you think I've missed. So let's dive into it. The NTSB says that loss of control accidents are the largest type of general aviation accidents, and these are the kinds of things that usually happen at low levels or shortly after takeoff or in the traffic pattern. And they say that there are multiple reasons for these loss of control accidents, such as pilot distraction, loss of situation awareness, or weather. And they also say that stalls are heavily involved. And I would contend, by the way, that some of those stalls result because of a distraction. Now, when I think back to all the errors that I have made over the years, some of which have led to some minor bending of metal of aircraft, I think most of my errors fell into several categories. Some of them were because I was tired. Some of them was because I was distracted. Some of them were from lack of knowledge. Some were kind of low glucose. I just wasn't, fed well enough at that point in time. And I think over the years, what's happened is more of those errors have been a result of distraction, and fewer of those have been because of lack of knowledge. And so I think the distractions are really a major cause of accidents, and I don't think that the NTSB and the FAA really give pilots tools to deal with distractions. And here is the basic problem. When we're distracted, we don't notice that we're distracted. And that's really a conundrum for pilots, because if by definition a distraction has shifted a pilot's focus off of what he or she should be paying attention to, well, how does that pilot recognize in the moment that they are being distracted and then they need to refocus their attention on something more important than whatever that distracted them? So you understand the problem. And there are just countless examples of famous accidents where the pilot and crew were distracted. And if only they had known at the time they were being distracted, perhaps they could have shifted their attention back to the primary task and prevented an accident. And one of the most famous one of these was in December 1972. A passenger jet, a Lockheed L-1011, crashed in the Everglades when the crew became preoccupied with a landing light malfunction. And as they were troubleshooting this, they failed to notice that someone had inadvertently bumped off the autopilot. And as I recall, the aircraft was at 3,000 feet, basically in a hold, and the airplane just slowly, gradually descended into the swamp and killed everybody on board. Classic case of distraction. More recently, I just read about a Cessna 150 crash that occurred in May of 2014 in a wheat field near Watkins, Colorado. It killed the pilot and his passenger, and a recently released report reveals that the pilot probably lost control while taking selfie pictures with his cell phone. They noted that during the climb-out portion of the flight, the pilot used his cell phone to take a self-photograph. They think the camera's flash was activated and illuminated the cockpit area. Now, this was at night, unfortunately, and you can imagine a flash in the cockpit at night is a really bad thing. They did say that a GoPro was found near the camera in which several flights have been recorded, though the video did not capture that final flight. But they said on the footage of all these other flights that many of these flights, the pilot took pictures of himself with his cell phone, and that's why they think that he was doing that again. Now, another tragic distraction accident was one that where I met the accident pilot and spoke with him, a year or so afterwards, and really quite tragic. He had lost his mother about 9 days before, so he was quite upset. And he went back 9 days later to fly his Cessna 206 float plane on the lake, and he did just fine. But the next day, he had his young son on board, who I seem to recall was about 9 or 10 years old. And unfortunately, he was a little distracted by his son on board, and he landed on the water with his gear down, which caused the aircraft to immediately flip over, and unfortunately, his son drowned. Now, the video was made by this, and you can probably find it somewhere on AOPA. And he said afterwards that he was sufficiently recovered from his mother's death to fly alone, but what he had not realized was he was not sufficiently recovered to deal with the distraction of having his son on board. So a very tragic accident. Another one that comes to mind, there was a Cessna 182 that took off in Santa Rosa a number of years ago. IFR climbing up through the clouds, and during that climb out, and he was pretty far up. He was at least a couple thousand feet up, as I recall. Oakland Center told him that they were not seeing his transponder. And unfortunately, what they saw next was a transponder hit and then an aircraft spiraling out of the clouds. So apparently, as this pilot was reaching over to the right side of the airplane, fumbling with the transponder, he lost control of the aircraft. So those kinds of distractions are really deadly. So what is a distraction? Well, Wikipedia says it's divided attention from the chosen object of attention upon some source of distraction. It's usually caused by a lack of ability to pay attention, lack of interest in that object of attention, or the great intensity, novelty, or attractiveness of something other than the object of attention. And they say distractions come from both external sources and internal sources, which would be when you're thinking about something else as opposed to what you should be thinking about. Now, attention was originally defined by psychologist William James over 100 years ago as processing one of what seemed to be several simultaneous possible trains of thought, and it applies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, meaning you can't do it all at one time. Let's talk about multitasking, because it is a myth. Everything I read says the brain really can only do one thing at a time, that when we multitask, the brain actually is switching rapidly back and forth between two tasks. And according to University of Illinois psychology professor Daniel Simmons, for the most part, people can't truly multitask without costs. All of us juggle multiple demands on our time and multiple goals, but for the most part, we do that by switching among the demands rather than truly multitasking. He says true multitasking involves using the same cognitive mechanism simultaneously, but for different purposes. He said it's the mental equivalent of trying to talk, hum, and whistle all at the same time. He said it's not doable. He said the problem with multitasking is that people don't have great intuition about which activities require the same cognitive mechanisms. And it turns out that having a conversation on a phone and driving interfere with each other. We can't do both at the same time without one or the other or both suffering. But on the surface, it's just not intuitive why such skills might tap the same underlying abilities at the same time. He says multitasking is most dangerous when we don't realize we're doing it. So over the last couple of years, I've been researching distractions and flying, and it turns out there's a lot more literature out there about distractions while driving. So let me tell you a little bit about that. SafeStart.com says there are 4 sources of distractions when driving, and they are visual, auditory, manual distraction, and cognitive distraction. Visual is looking at something other than the road, they say. In an aircraft, that might be looking inside and not paying attention to the outside, where we've got traffic, weather, and terrain. Auditory, hearing something not related. So in an airplane, that could be a flight instructor or passenger making a non-pertinent comment at a critical time in flight, or it could be, as an IFR student once told me, that ATC always seems to call just as we're simultaneously leveling off and joining an airway all at the same time. And I agreed with him. It did happen a number of times when he and I were flying together. Manual distraction, they say that that's handling something other than the steering wheel. And if we go to the FAA's AC 61-67C, they say that stalls resulting from improper airspeed management are most likely to occur when the pilot is distracted by one or more other tasks, including, and they mention a number of reasons, including these kinds of manual distraction: locating a checklist or similar item, attempting to retrieve a dropped item, reaching behind the pilot's seat or in the glove compartment. Obviously, there comes a time when if you drop something, you do have to reach behind the seat to get it, or to refer to a chart or things like that. But the point is to realize that these distractions put you at high risk of stalling the aircraft. So you want to delay some kinds of actions, if possible, when you're near the ground, and certainly when you're in turning flight and you're at less than high cruise indicated airspeed. So in other words, fly the airplane first and then deal with the distraction, perhaps later. Cognitive distraction. Now that's thinking about anything else other than driving, or in this case, flying. When we fly, it could be that we're distracted by how beautiful the area is that we're flying over, or if you've had a major life event such as the death of a loved one in the accident we just talked about earlier, a divorce, you've moved, or you have a major illness, any of these major life events, it's sometimes hard to take your mind off of these events, so that's not a time when it would be wise to fly. Now, SafeStart.com also says that there are 4 states that cause or contribute to critical errors when people's eyes or their minds are not on the task at hand. And these 4 states are rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency. Now, let me tell you a quick personal story. Years ago, I used to rush around in just about every aspect of my life, and I would even rush when I was at the airport. And that rushing around led to multiple incidents where I either tripped on a chain or banged my head on the wing or other similar kinds of things at the airport. And I also sometimes used to rush through checklists to try and get flying more quickly. And what I've learned over the years is that all of that rushing around is really a false economy, especially when you're flying. It almost never saves any time, but it does lead to bumps, bruises, missed items on checklists and things like that. So for years, whenever I reached the airport, I would always consciously slow down at the airport, and that has really paid great dividends. Now, when I started researching the topic, I was trying to figure out how do you know in the moment that you're being distracted? And as I mentioned before, it's pretty hard to know that at the time. But what I realized over time as I was researching, there are some things that you can do when you realize that you've been distracted. And also, I found out that there are some procedures and practices that you can put in place that'll help you anticipate distractions and not be surprised by them when they occur. Plus, there is some literature that addresses how best to prepare yourself personally so that you're less likely to be distracted. Now, the best technique I ever observed for dealing with distractions was while I was teaching the owner of a Cessna Citation, which had been recently retrofitted with a Garmin G1000 glass cockpit. Something occurred during that flight, and I really don't remember what it was, but I remember the exact words of the pilot at the time. He said, "That's a distraction, and I'll deal with it on the ground." I was really impressed because by recognizing the distraction and immediately labeling it as such, he delayed dealing with the distraction and immediately refocused on the task at hand. Now, at some critical phases of flight, such as takeoff or landing, delaying dealing with a distraction is often the best and sometimes the only choice. But note that this pilot had 3 other choices. He could have ignored the distraction altogether and never dealt with it at all. He could have delegated that task and perhaps have asked me to do it, whatever that distraction was. Or he could have handled the distraction himself but asked me to take over flying the airplane. But in this case, he recognized that the distraction was secondary to what we were doing at the time and that neither of us should spend any time on it at that particular point in time. Now, I asked some professional pilots, friends of mine over the last couple of years, how they deal with distractions and how they recognize them. And Bob Reinhardt is a corporate pilot. He said that he's most likely to get distracted when he's complacent, which is most likely to occur when flying into an airport into which you're really familiar, such as your home airport. By contrast, he said pilots are totally focused when flying IFR into an unfamiliar airport. And I talked with Debbie Cunningham, also a corporate pilot. She said you really want to anticipate what kind of distractions could occur. So think about them ahead of time so that you'll recognize them when they occur. And think about them generically. What kinds of distractions could happen on any flight and what might happen specifically on this particular flight, perhaps due to a certain passenger being on board or something like that. And also think about the next things. The next thing's going to be occurring on the flight. And if you are not doing what's going to be next, then apparently you are perhaps distracted. She also says that any surprise by definition may be a distraction. So if you're surprised, realize at that moment that surprise is almost certainly a potential distraction. She said to think of all possible distractions and try to address them ahead of time. Tell passengers, don't talk when I'm on final. Tell them when you've raised your hand, that means they need to stop talking because you are talking on the radio at the time. And if they keep talking, just wave your hands even more rapidly. Also, use standard operating procedures and checklists and fly the same way every time. That way, if something is different, you may realize at that moment that that difference indicates some distraction has occurred. Now, always treat interruptions as a red flag. So anytime you're interrupted in the middle of a task, such as a pre-flight inspection, when you resume the task, make sure that you go back several steps so that you make sure there's no chance of skipping a step, which is really common during interruptions. Now, airline crews operating under Part 121 have had sterile cockpit rule since 1981, and that was instituted after a series of accidents caused by flight crews who were distracted from their flying duties in non-essential conversations. So now if a crew is below 10,000 feet, they cannot be talking about sports or their pension plan. This is also a useful concept for general aviation, but we may have to modify it a little to our purposes because our flights often never reach 10,000 feet. So instead, a GA pilot might want to impose a sterile cockpit rule when he or she is within 15 miles of either the departure or the destination airport. Now, complying with the sterile cockpit rule during taxi in or taxi out from the runway really requires a lot of discipline because I see a lot of pilots who just have a sense of relief immediately after touchdown. They kind of feel like, hey, the hard part is done. I think I've mentioned before that 50% of the insurance claims for one local club I fly with have been attributed to taxiing and parking issues, the most recent of which was a pilot who hit a fuel truck while taxiing. Of course, you kind of ask, how did that happen? So what that really tells you is you really ought to pay attention to distractions even when you're on the ground because you might not be as alert to them at that point in time. Now, the NTSB has said that loss of control accidents happen in all phases of flight, but they say that approach to landing, maneuvering, and the initial climb out statistically are the deadliest phases of flight for loss of control accidents. So what that tells you is those are the phases where you want to be most cognizant of paying attention and avoiding distractions. Because when airplanes are close to the ground, like in the landing pattern, there's really limited time and altitude available to recover from any stall or spin, which really makes stalls at that time particularly deadly. Now, for me personally, I'm always particularly alert during takeoff to make sure that a pilot doesn't over-rotate and perhaps stall. I often see pilots just pitch up to 15 degrees and sometimes 20 without even really thinking about it, when more typically a pitch of about 10 degrees is all that's needed and sometimes a little bit less. And when landing, from the time I reach the numbers on downwind, boy, I'm constantly monitoring both the pitch attitude of the aircraft, which way it's pointed up or down, and the airspeed. So, for example, I often see pilots will let the aircraft pitch up on base as they add flaps, and that causes the airspeed to bleed off. And for some planes like Cirrus and the Diamond DA-40, I like to add some nose down trim every time I add some flaps. And I'm always on the alert for anything that's out of the ordinary when I'm landing. For example, one of the 2 times in my flying career when a stall horn came on unexpectedly was when the tower gave us a 360-degree turn while on the downwind for spacing. Now, the pilot didn't add enough power and we got slow. So now anytime we have to do a 360, that's a red flag for me, and I pay a lot of extra attention to the airspeed. Now, I've run across a study a couple of times here on the internet from NASA's ASRS, that's the Aviation Safety Reporting System. Those are the folks that you send the form to anytime you have an incident. And in 1998, they said that there are 4 primary factors that generate interruptions or distractions in the cockpit. And they said that these can be subtle and momentary or intrusive, but they can all be disruptive to flight. And those 4 things are communications, heads down activity, responding to an abnormal condition or unanticipated situation, or searching for traffic after a TCAS alert. And they expanded on this just a little bit. They said for communications, some of the examples, and some of these were airline related, receiving the final waits while taxiing, a flight attendant entering the cockpit, calls from ATC or on the company radio. But obviously, we too can have distractions over the radio as well too, or over the intercom from our passengers. Heads down activity, which would include reading an approach chart or programming the flight management system while not paying attention to other tasks that are more important. Responding to an abnormal condition or unanticipated situation. They said, for example, system malfunctions, and of course that Lockheed L-1011 crash in Florida we talked about is an example of that. Other kinds of abnormal conditions would be weather or environmental threats, and of course weather certainly has an impact for general aviation aircraft, so you want to always be paying attention to changes in the weather. And the fourth item they said was searching for traffic after an alert. And I see all kinds of issues with people who are mishandling dealing with traffic alerts. For example, I see people who are actively searching for traffic called by ATC, but who aren't also taking action to try and avoid that traffic ahead of time. I see people who totally ignore traffic calls, probably because I'm sitting there and they think that I'm looking for the traffic. And I also see people get very distracted by very loud traffic alerts from traffic systems that occur when they're on final. And these are generated by aircraft on the ground who have their Mode C transponders in the alt mode, which unfortunately is what we're all supposed to be doing when we're on the ground these days, even though there are only a few large commercial airports that use information for their surface radar systems. Anyway, there are lots of ways to get distracted by traffic alerts. Now, what do you do when you recognize a distraction? Some interruptions and distractions are subtle and potentially difficult to detect. So the first priority has to be aware that the normal flow of activity has somehow been interrupted. And then your next priority is to reestablish situational awareness and try and accomplish this through the following steps. So identify first, what was I doing? Then ask, where was I interrupted? And then finally, make a decision and act. Think about what decision or action shall I take to get back on track. And when you're making that decision, always prioritize aviate, navigate, communicate in that order. And of course, if you plan your activities, you're going to notice disruptions. And of course, you want to be able to postpone some of those actions if necessary because of disruptions, but then make sure you get back to them. If you're interrupted, make an explicit note, verbalize that you got interrupted so that you and your colleagues will know that you need to go back. Now, if you do get distracted and as a result are behind the airplane, always be willing to try and buy more time. Tell ATC that you need a delay. I see this all the time, especially with student pilots and low-time private pilots. They're not set up as they arrive at the airport, and yet they continue plowing on straight ahead to the airport. Turn away from the airport. Make sure you get fully set up. There are always ways to make more time. You don't want to arrive and not be ready. Now let's look at something totally different, and that's trying to improve your focus and concentration, which is one way to deal with distractions. This is not something I had really thought about until I started the research, but I found an article by Dr. Julie Schwartzbard at bettermind.com. And for better or worse, there are a number of things that you can do to help improve your focus and concentration, which should help deal with distractions. Factors, she says, that impair focus are poor diet and nutrition. She says that weight loss diets are notoriously bad for focus and concentration. Hunger, now that's a distraction we've all had, and studies show that low blood sugar can quickly lead to fatigue and low energy levels, and that's going to wreak havoc on your ability to focus. Another is dehydration. Loss of focus is one of the side effects of not drinking enough water, and studies prove it. Even having just 1% lower than optimal hydration can cause a lack of focus. Lack of sleep. This is a big one, I think, for many of us, because if you don't get enough sleep, even for just one night, your thought processes slow down, you're less alert than normal, and your ability to concentrate suffers. Now, that can lead to confusion so that you can't perform tasks that regularly require complex thought. And it's also hard to remember and learn new things if you're sleepy, and that also affects focus negatively. Inadequate sleep, they say, cuts into working memory, which is an important part of focus. It makes you less vigilant, reduces both your accuracy and speed on mental tasks. And if your sleep problems become chronic, then your reduced ability to focus can become your new normal, and that's going to affect everything in your life, including employment, relationships, and personal growth. And sleep, frankly, is one of those things. About a month or so ago, I decided to really focus on it. I'm enjoying getting a little extra sleep these days. Next one is stress. Well, stress is inevitable, but can have dire consequences on focus and concentration if it becomes chronic. Things like job worries, relationship issues, health concerns, all these things can make it hard to concentrate, though lots of people don't notice that happening until they become totally overwhelmed. And when you're mentally exhausted, you eventually will have difficulty with concentration and attention, which will make it easier to get distracted. Medical, emotional, and psychological problems, any serious issue that impairs your health can hurt your focus. So they list a few things like sleep apnea, ADHD, stroke, injury, dementia, depression, bipolar disorder, emotional trauma, and so on. Lack of physical activity. If you don't exercise, they say you won't know how deeply your ability to focus is affected until you actually start moving. So just to summarize what the doctor says, factors that impair focus are poor diet and nutrition, hunger, dehydration, lack of sleep, stress, medical, emotional, and psychological problems, and lack of physical activities. Okay, so let's just summarize what we've talked about here on how to deal with deadly distractions. Of course, distraction is one of the major causes of loss of control accidents. But the problem is when we're distracted, we don't notice that we're distracted. So one way to deal with that, use standard operating procedures and checklist and fly the same way every time you fly. That way, when you see some interruption in the process, that should be a red flag for you, which will tell you that you've had a distraction. Now, if you're interrupted during a task like a pre-flight inspection, when you resume the task, make sure you go back several steps so that there is no chance of skipping a step, which is very common after an interruption. Go ahead and think ahead of time about what kind of distractions might occur when you fly. Go ahead and list them down. That way, if you thought about them ahead of time, you'll recognize them when they occur. Also impose a sterile cockpit when you're within 15 miles of either your departure or your destination airport, and also while you're taxiing. And pay attention to those critical times when accidents are most likely to occur. That's when you're taking off and on the approach to landing, and anytime you're in the traffic pattern maneuvering close to the ground. And when you do recognize a distraction, label it as such. Just call out, "That's a distraction," and then choose one of 4 actions. You can ignore the distraction altogether. You can defer dealing with it until later, perhaps on the ground. You can delegate the distraction for someone else to deal with, or you can deal with the distraction then, perhaps while asking another pilot to fly the plane. Well, appreciate any feedback you have on dealing with deadly distractions. As I said, I would like to turn this into an article sometime, so your feedback is greatly appreciated. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback and questions. One listener asked, how do you configure the ADS-B out so that you can see traffic on a portable ADS-B receiver? Bet you didn't know that. Just because you have ADS-B out doesn't mean you're going to necessarily see the traffic on the portable ADS-B receiver unless it's been configured correctly. We'll be right back. And I want to thank a couple of listeners for the reviews in the Apple Podcast app. This one comes from New Zealand. I had mentioned that no reviews had come in yet from New Zealand, and Shane G. wrote to say, nope, he had posted one back in June. I still can't see it here, but that's just because iTunes is pretty funky. But his review said, Max, your podcast is great. Have enjoyed it immensely. Keep up the good work. So thanks for that first review from New Zealand, Shane. Appreciate that. And from here in the U.S., LKN Aviator. And I don't know what LKN stands for. I was guessing that was an airport, but apparently not. He says it's a must listen for GA pilots and enthusiasts and a whole bunch of other nice things as well. So thanks so much for that. And let's see some of the other listener feedback we've gotten from Twitter. Arthur Waite said, this was a fantastic episode, Max. I just listened last week. Many thanks to you for the podcast, and especially to Jan Sears and his CHP colleagues for their incredible work. And so that was about our interview regarding the wildfires here in California. And Jan, of course, was a CHP pilot who discovered those fires. And here's a text who came from Jorge, who's somebody I know. I fly his Cirrus. He says, just listen to your podcast from this week. Really excellent as usual, but the call-outs for the A5, that's the Icon A5, were spot on. And of course, what we were saying was it really seems like they're trying to normalize low-altitude maneuvering with fancy names like low-alt and things like that. Anyway, he says, congratulations and thank you. I really appreciate the culture of safety you espouse. Have a wonderful weekend. Well, thanks for that, Jorge. And from Facebook, Ramon is a student pilot. He says, I've been listening to Aviation News Talk podcast. Great show. It has made my afternoon commute so much better, and I've gleaned plenty of wisdom. I especially enjoyed the episode about the Icon A5. And Ramon says he's based at the David Wayne Hooks Memorial Airport in Houston, where I'm planning to land on Thursday night. And let me give a big shout out to his flight school, Texas Flight. Congratulations to them for winning AOPA's Best Flight School in the Southwestern region in 2017. And that's all part of AOPA's Flight Training Excellent Awards. Also, some feedback from Glenn via Facebook. He says, Max, I would give your podcast a review on iTunes as I want a New Zealand review, but I don't use Apple products. Well, Glenn, you can actually download iTunes onto a PC, but I'm not going to suggest you do it. I'm sure it's not worth the trouble, but thanks for the thought. And from Twitter, Derek, who I recognize as one of our Patreon supporters, he says, you did a Thanksgiving Day episode? Dedication, brother. I'll listen to it along my flight. He mentions the route he's flying and drive to Sunrise Beach route tomorrow. Loving your podcast as a non-flying av geek. Well, thank you for that, Derek. And from Twitter, Isaac sent along a video, and in it, Emirates shows their smallest aircraft, the SR20, meeting its big brother. So just a little background on this. Back in September, Emirates took delivery of the first two of a total of 22 SR-22s that they've purchased for flight training. And Emirates created this really cute video welcoming one of the new little brothers to the fleet where it meets an A380. It's a great video. So thanks to Isaac for sending that to me. And it's posted on our Patreon page. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And it's a free posting. Anybody can see it, and you watch this really cute video. Now let's turn to some listener questions.
Hi, Max, and this is Pablo from Puerto Rico. I wanted to ask you, is there a valid reason or reasons for a pilot to avoid flying the established traffic pattern for an airport other than ATC instructions? Thank you so much.
Pablo, thanks for taking the time to send your question. You may recall I mentioned Pablo back in episode 36, and he says that internet service is now back on in his area as well as the electric power. And he said he's got a so-called normal life, but that there's still a lot of work to be done throughout Puerto Rico. Well, Pablo, to answer your question, it really kind of depends whether you're at a towered airport or a non-towered airport. At towered airports, pretty much anything goes. Usually there, the only standard would be the traffic pattern altitude, and everybody should adhere to that. But otherwise, you can exit and enter the traffic pattern at a towered airport in any fashion that air traffic control authorized. Now, at non-towered airports, in addition to having a specified traffic pattern altitude, the chart supplement, which is the new name for what people used to call the airport facility directory, will specify in addition whether there's a right traffic pattern or a left traffic pattern to be used at that airport. And yes, pilots are always supposed to conform with the traffic pattern that's specified on their sectional chart or in the chart supplement. But often I see pilots fly non-standard patterns either because they didn't take the time to find out what kind of traffic pattern was specified, or maybe because they felt entitled and felt that they could do whatever they wanted to do, which, by the way, is mostly true if nobody is around to see them fly the pattern incorrectly. But if there's an accident, they could be cited by the FAA for flying the pattern incorrectly. That is, if they survive the accident. Now, of course, in emergencies, you can violate any FAR. That means you can violate any regulation, fly the pattern however you need to during an emergency. Safety always comes first. There are also some cases where people may be practicing instrument approaches with a circle to land, and sometimes the circle to land at the very end of the instrument approach won't conform with the standard traffic pattern. And here's a question that came to me via Chuck Gensler, who's a friend of mine. He is the 2017 National Flight Instructor of the Year. So he and I both had the same award in different years. I've known Chuck for a while because we both teach in Cirrus Aircraft, and he's based with Independence Aviation at Centennial Airport in Colorado. Now, Chuck forwarded an email from a client of his named Marty. Marty wrote, Trescott talks about a limitation on ADS-B, and he was talking about portable receivers. He says, if I understand it correctly, the problem is that unless you are using ADS-B out and are not in Alaska, you do not get info on aircraft around you other than line of sight from other aircraft and as a parasite on their signals. And yes, Marty, you have that correct. Does this mean that this is not a problem if you have a portable unit with ADS-B out as well as ADS-B in? And does the Stratus 2S, which has dual band, have ADS-B out and therefore avoid this problem? Well, first of all, Marty, the FAA does not permit the use of portable ADS-B out transmitters in an aircraft for a variety of reasons. I know one of them is antenna placement, which obviously they can't specify with a portable unit. So none of the portable ADS-B receivers out there, such as the Stratus, have an ADS-B out capability. Now, there's a more important aspect to Marty's question. Just because an aircraft is fully compliant and has a built-in ADS-B out solution does not automatically mean that a portable ADS-B receiver will receive that missing traffic. Now, for everything to work correctly, when the ADS-B out solution was installed in the aircraft, the avionics technician needed to, at that time, configure it to transmit a couple of bits that tell the computers on the ground that you have an ADS-B receiver on board the aircraft and that they should then upload the ADS-B traffic for your aircraft on the next transmission. Now, those bits must be set to say whether or not you have a 978 receiver on board or just a 1090 receiver on board, or whether you have both on board or whether you have neither on board. Now, those can only be set by the avionics technician. There is no user access to that. Now, you might wonder if you're flying a rental aircraft that has ADS-B out, whether or not it has been configured to allow traffic to be transmitted up to your ship. And there is a way to find out if you are a ForeFlight user. I'm sure there's a way with other applications as well, too. And specifically, you want to go into the ForeFlight Mobile Pilot's Guide on page 263, which I will go ahead and read to you. I've got it right here. And it's under the heading Own Ship ADS-B Out Information. It says, if your aircraft is equipped with ADS-B Out that is correctly configured and transmitting, tap the Own Ship ADS-B Out entry in the ADS-B receiver status to see the tail number, altitude, and location being broadcast by your ADS-B Out equipment. If your aircraft is not equipped with ADS-B Out, or the ADS-B Out is improperly configured or is not transmitting, the Own Ship ADS-B Out entry will show not detected. In other words, you will not see the N number for your aircraft. So that's an easy way to figure out if it's been configured correctly. Now, if you're flying a rental aircraft that's not configured correctly, you might want to talk to the FBO, the flying club, or the owner of that aircraft and see if they can take it back to the shop and have it configured so that you can receive traffic with an ADS-B portable receiver when you're flying that particular aircraft. And if you're not familiar with the ForeFlight Mobile Pilot's Guide, I'll go ahead and put it up on our Patreon site right now. So just type into a web browser aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. That's AWESOME, and click on posts, and you'll find a free post there that everybody can see, which is this large 300-plus page document for ForeFlight. And that's all the time we have for questions this week. Hey, if you want to follow my trip across the United States this week, just go out to flightaware.com and type in N488CD, which is November 488 Charlie Delta, and you'll be able to track my progress. I should be up flying Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and feel free to say hello to me via Twitter while I'm in flight. You can just find me at Max Trescott. And I'd like to ask you to do one thing, and that is make a list of all your friends who you think might enjoy Aviation News Talk, and then share it with them. The app you're listening to right now probably has a little share button somewhere on there, so you can just send this episode to a friend via email. And for your non-techie friends, of course, tell them to look for the Aviation News Talk app, both for iPhones and iPads in the App Store. But also you can tell them to download the Spotify app, which is available for both iOS and for Android phones. And if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now so I can help arrange a free demo flight for you if you're considering a new Cirrus, but also help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious, in about the differences and trade-offs in buying a new versus a slightly used Cirrus. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the country. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. Unlimited number of skips when you're listening to the music. You can also download. You can also download and listen to songs offline and play any random music track that you want.